right, so for today's emergency update, we're just doing it informally here in the warehouse. No fancy illustrative visual diagram behind me to interact with, so you're just going to have to take it for what it is. What I'm going to talk about is more important anyways, because Russia has just been left with fewer options today, which of course brings us one step closer to nuclear Armageddon. This is what has happened today, a lot in the last 24 hours. Effectively, one of their only real allies with any pull in the NATO alliance, Turkey, has completely turned their back on Russia, it would appear. They're going to get F-16s, they're going to join the EU, they send the Azov members back, they want Ukraine to join NATO or whatever is left of it, and it doesn't look good, okay? This is the classic double cross. The Russia bros are going to be coping with this, trying to explain it away as nothing, but it's certainly not nothing. Turkey has always been a staging ground for U.S. nuclear weapons, and you could pretty much see this coming from a mile away. They were sitting on the fence until the last minute when they had to make a choice. Well, guess what? Now they have to make a choice. Believe it or not, Russia and Ukraine aren't even at war yet. All of this stuff that we've been talking about for the last 18 months, the countries have not even declared war on each other. Even Ukraine has not declared war on Russia for numerous reasons, but we're going to talk about what will happen if and when that does happen, because it appears as though security guarantees in the form of umbrella framework is going to be introduced in the next 2 days at Vilnius. We're going to talk about what exactly that is going to mean for Kiev. Essentially, what it's going to mean is that they're going to propose a coalition of the willing, some organization that's outside of NATO that's going to offer security guarantees, effectively putting Russia in a state of war with the countries who are partaking in that coalition of the willing. Thus, an attack on those countries in that context might not trigger Article 5. Okay, so this is how we see the escalation into a war in broader Europe without it necessarily triggering Article 5, because it's going to be under the framework of this coalition of the willing. These commitments, according to diplomats, would exist outside the scope of NATO's framework and would not oblige these nations to deploy troops in defense of Ukraine in the event of another attack. However, it would likely make it voluntary for them to do so, and thus open the door for more support for Ukraine in the form of actual boots on the ground. We know there's already specialists on the ground, there's special ops on the ground, but now we're talking about more of the same, plus possibly troops, infantry, things of that nature. So it's not looking good. They're already talking about canceling the membership action plan requirements for Ukraine, and that means that it's going to be all the easier for Ukraine to enter NATO. What it appears as though is happening is this. Just today, we got word that not only Turkey, but Germany is going to be officially starting the building of a weapons factory in Western Ukraine. So it's looking very likely that the only way you would make a commitment into $100 million, in some cases, I think it's hundreds of millions of dollars to build these factories. The only way you would make such a commitment is you knew that the investment was going to be protected, thus security guarantees. So what does that mean then? It means that you're likely to see some portion of Western Ukraine be incorporated or covered under the auspices of NATO's protective umbrella, and perhaps not the zone of conflict that I've talked about yesterday. I proposed this, where they may say, look, what Russia has annexed already, that's not going to fall under Article 5 because there's already a war there. But everything west of such and such, maybe this will be covered under some sort of security guarantee coalition of the willing framework. And thus, if and when Russia does effectively start targeting those places, because of course the whole purpose of this special military operation is to demilitarize Ukraine, if and when it's inevitable, of course, that they target that region in order to cut the supply lines of Ukraine, then what does that mean? Does that mean that the coalition of the willing will then help Ukraine in staging a broader offensive into Russian territory. What we're seeing here, guys, is escalation towards World War III. There is no doubt about it. Whether it's the Turkey turncoats or whether it's the security guarantees offered here by NATO, we have Serbia suspending arms exports because they need to be ready for any aggression. And Serbia, of course, is a primary exporter of weapon systems, so they're taking a big blow to their economy, especially during a war like this. It must be deadly serious if they are suspending delivery of weapon shipments abroad at this period of time. We also have a very close call. NATO plane entered, according to flight radar. Flight radar is not always 100% accurate, but according to flight radar, NATO's airborne early warning system control plane entered Belarusian airspace. Are they trying to provoke the Belarusians into doing something is the question at this point in time, okay? So this is a early warning and control system. It's used for reconnaissance and surveillance, communications, and otherwise. Effectively, it is a spy plane. So having a spy plane enter your airspace is grounds for that spy plane to be shut down, to be taken out of the sky. Are they testing to see what the resolve of the Belarusians is now that they have tactical nuclear weapons? Are there provocative actions happening? Here's the gist of it. NATO right now, according to NATO anyways, can only muster as a coalition, as a alliance, just so we don't get those two terms confused. The coalition of the willing is something separate from NATO, but the NATO alliance itself can only currently muster 40,000 troops in the direction of Belarus and Russia in this conflict right now. So they're talking about getting a force of 300,000 ready, but that's going to take a couple years. So if we're talking about imminent escalation of the conflict, they're relying on their nuclear arsenal. They're relying on their nuclear arsenal in order to deter the Russians. It appears that they're going for broke here. They're going to propose that Ukraine skirts the what is it called? The Membership Action Plan requirement. They're going to propose these security guarantees, which are really just a veiled form of NATO membership anyways, even though Ukraine is already de facto member state as is. Everybody knows that. So they're going to escalate the conflict and potentially put Ukraine on par with other NATO countries, hoping that that in itself deters further Russian offensive. Because I believe what is happening right now is that if it's true that this counteroffensive has failed and the Russians appear to be amassing more troops along the eastern front of in eastern Ukraine, it appears as though they're getting ready to possibly do an offensive of their own. If that is true, then NATO might be terrified and they might be doing this as a last-ditch effort. The problem is, of course, is that it could have there's the risk that if Russia does perceive these infringements and if Russia does not allow these weapons factories in Western Ukraine and they target them, what will the outcome be and what sort of escalatory trajectory is that going to follow? So it does not look good. And of course, on the same day, NATO members have agreed to a regional defense plan against Russian attack. This is a revised Cold War era plan that would see all of the NATO countries come together in their increment amounts and amass their forces to try to effectively deter against Russian aggression, even though this is silly on its face because, of course, any war with Russia is likely going to immediately go to the nuclear level. At least that's what we are told. There may be ways where they fight this thing out conventionally for a long, long time before it actually goes nuclear. The way things have been progressing so gradually so far, I would not be surprised if we see something like that. I mean, I've always said that I would not be surprised if we see the normalization of the use of tactical nuclear weapons in everyday combat scenarios that doesn't necessarily evolve immediately to the strategic level, because there's been a lot here that's defied and that's been counterintuitive since this conflict has started. There's been so many red lines that have been crossed that have not been checked with a corresponding amount of aggression and revenge from the Russians. They don't seem to be interested in exacting revenge for the Crimean Bridge, for Nord Stream, for attacks on their nuclear triad, for attempted attacks on the nuclear base, for attempted assassination attacks. There appears to be no reprisals, at least up until this point in time. But eventually, ultimately, that line will get crossed and war will be declared. Now, here is why, according to Georgy Riper, an intelligence specialist, a Russian intelligence specialist, he says this is the reason why Russia has not officially declared war yet. And it has little to do with humanitarian reasons, okay? It says, if Russia declares war on Ukraine, the Russian forces will have to bomb Ukrainian cities. Russia does not bomb Ukrainian cities and civilian facilities. Remember, this is according to a Russian intelligence specialist, and we need to put emotion aside for a second and understand that while there is still collateral damage, that they are not specifically targeting, and even the United States Department of Defense admits that there's not the explicit and persistent and ongoing total declaration of war by the Russians against the Ukrainians, that they are still picking targets, mostly critical infrastructure. That doesn't mean that there's not collateral damage, it just means that it's minimized. If Russia declares war on Ukraine, the Russian forces will have to bomb Ukrainian cities. Russia does not bomb Ukrainian cities and civilian facilities, but targets military equipment, ammunition, command, energy, and logistical facilities. So, if their goal is to demilitarize Ukraine, and Ukraine continually just gets remilitarized by NATO and is now planning on building large weapons facilities in the West, that can only mean one thing. That can only mean that the West is about to commit in some way, shape, or form and extend these security guarantees. No company is going to build a weapons manufacturing facility in a war zone unless they have 100% guarantees that that thing is not going to be blown to smithereens. Come on, it just does not make sense whatsoever. And why on earth would these countries not want to manufacture it in their own countries? I don't know all the details, all the legal minutiae, but I'm sure there's something to that as well. The other reasons are as follows. Russia does not need martial law and general mobilization that automatically come into force in the case of a war. According to Vladimir Putin and Russian media sources that have been quoted ever since the beginning of the conflict, if you believe it, he has an 80% approval rating. I would think that would fluctuate a bit more than it has. It appears to not fluctuate at all. While I do believe that it is much higher than many Western leaders for a variety of reasons. Obviously, historically, the Russians have an understanding, a deeper patriotic understanding of what this particular conflict and its historical context are. Thus, they are perhaps more willing to support their leader in his cause, but I do think it would be naive to presume that 80% is a 100% randomized sample gathered in the most empirical fashion possible. It's questionable. Anyways, he would have to evoke martial law. They talk about how they would have to set up internment camps and would provide a plethora of legal consequences for civilian courts in the event of a declaration of war. Of course, it would mean that a lot of people who are currently maybe not under surveillance right now would have to be put under surveillance, because total war is total war. We're talking about something that would be akin to the bombing of Baghdad, or the, what was it called? What did they call it? The carpet bombing of Iraq. There was a term, shock and awe. Something akin to that. And the Russians don't want to do that. Obviously, they share a lot of population, not only ethnically, but culturally as well. So it's not their preference to just, attack civilians in that sort of fashion more indiscriminately. But what they're saying here is that now that they have less options, and because Turkey has clearly turned its back on Russia, there's no way to slice it. Okay, there's no sugarcoating what Turkey has now done. And while you can say that they're just doing what they have to do, Turkey does have the biggest military in Europe. Turkey could have put a little bit more pressure. Sweden, really, you know, an army of 40,000 people, it's, to be quite frank, it's not a huge deal whether or not they got into NATO at all. It boils down to whether or not Ukraine is going to get into NATO. And of course, ceremoniously, Ukraine, it looks like, will be good old member number 33. Don't get me started on that. Once again, but Russia is still fulfilling its energy transit obligations with the EU that transit through Ukraine, which is just crazy to me, which is, you know, all the more reason why this whole non-declaration of war thing actually holds some merit, because they're still transiting gas through Ukraine, albeit limited. And if Russia is still fulfilling its energy transit obligations with the EU, that will have to be interrupted when the war is declared. And he goes on to say, interestingly, Kiev has not declared war on the Russian Federation either. Even though the Kiev regime screams and shouts about war with Russia on every corner, they have not declared war because they would then become an aggressor state, because obviously it would necessitate them to going over the border, and they would lose support from the West because, of course, it would result in the imminent escalation of nuclear war. So that is the tight line, the tightrope that is being walked right now. That is the dance that is currently happening. It's a lot of semantics to describe exactly what is going on. NATO and Russia are in a state of de facto war, and it's about to become de jure. And that means that it's good time to stock up on your bunkers and, you know, get your food supplies and all the rest. We do have 100 and I think we have about 100 left. We have 100 Geiger counters that have been built in-house by a resident nuclear physicist and his entourage of manufacturers, if you will, who assemble Geiger counters which are specifically tuned for post-nuclear war survival. Most of the Geiger counters you find on Amazon, for reasons that we've explained in previous videos, and we're actually going to be working with them to do a dedicated video when the next run happens. I believe it's not happening till September, so the next availability of these Geiger counters will be in October, but not all Geiger counters are the same. They have to be able to parse out a certain type of radiation from the background radiation and alert you at a certain threshold. And most of the Geiger counters, if not all, don't do that. And these ones actually do, and they're made locally by a person that we've interviewed on the channel before. So you can go and check that out. I'll post a link in the description below. But that's what I got for you today, guys. So all I would say is keep on prepping. Things just keep on escalating. This summit at Vilnius is basically the authorization of an escalation of conflict against the Russians. And it's all happening. It's just happening in slow motion. You would not have Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, and good old Zelensky meeting in Vilnius under the cover of Patriot missile defense systems, just a stone's throw away from Belarusian tactical nuclear weapons, if this wasn't deadly 100% serious. And the scary part is, you know, I would actually be less concerned if NATO had a larger standing force. And I've said this time and time again. People, when they look at the numbers, they always look at NATO countries' total military power. You cannot look at that, because all of those countries are going to prioritize their best soldiers, their best equipment. They're going to keep that stuff for themselves, and they're going to give all the leftovers to NATO and who is on the front line. So while it might be true, say, that the UK has an army of, I think they can only something like 50,000 guys or something at any given time, but let's just say theoretically they have an army of 250,000 guys. They're never going to send their best guys to fight with the NATO alliance, because for starters, it's an alliance, but it's not something which is written in stone. So they still have to look out for the people who border them. As much as they may be allied with the Germans, they don't know when the tides are going to change. So they're never going to commit their best. So really, when you're comparing the numbers between Russia, you know, there's that diagram that shows Russia versus 32 of the most, at least economically, in a retail-based economy, or a, what do they call it? Not a resource-based economy, but a service-based economies, powerful economies, powerful GDP, gross domestic product countries. As even though Russia, when you run the numbers compared to is completely dwarfed, it's like 100 times less economically powerful. You really just have to take 10% of NATO, because that's what they're going to commit. They're going to commit 10% of their militaries, which are already paltry for the most part. Most of them don't have. Turkey has a little bit of experience, I suppose, in Syria. The United States is holding on to everything it has. I mean, if people genuinely believe that the United States has 9,000 Abrams tanks and they're not able to put together 30 by the end of the year, that they truly think that this is a legitimate existential threat, above and beyond it being a financial economic threat, then like I said, I got some beachfront property to sell you up here in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. So that's pretty much all I got for you guys today. The war is going to get worse, and you got to keep on prepping, and it appears as though British Columbia is on fire. The fires are starting in British Columbia, and there's a lot of them. It's going to get smoky as hell in the month ahead, at least here. Maybe not so much down in the East Coast, although that fire in Quebec is still burning, which is insane because it's the size of a small country. But we got a new problem to deal with here in British Columbia. We're going to be releasing some videos that give you some ideas for different things you can do to not only purify the air, but also detect air quality and protect yourself against these toxic, age of extreme induced pollutions that we're going to be facing, whether they be radiological or of nature, of mankind's inducing, I should say, of our creation. Let's just put it simply. Okay, guys, so take care, and if you need a Geiger counter, check out the link in the description below. There's only 100 until October, so they're going to fly out the door probably in the next 24 hours, so I'd encourage you to get them now. And if you need emergency food, you can see we got a lot of it. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.